It is finally here. This is the Noctua NF-A14x25 G2. Yes, it has finally happened. Noctua decided to release its next generation 140mm fan after postponing it again and again and again. But who cares? Here it is in all of its glory, and I can happily report this is no longer happening. The square version is indeed strong. I can't bend it to the point where it stops. The new square NF-A14x25 G2 PWM exists in 3 different versions. We got a regular PWM one, then there is a low speed version, 800 RPM, no clue why anybody would get that, and we got a double boxed SX2 PP. We are going to talk some more about the noise differences or the noise implications for the PP version later on, but in a nutshell for now, the PP version consists of a PPA and a PPB fan, and both are being offset by 25 RPM from the original G2. Because apparently, if you look very closely, having 2 fans in a push-pull configuration at a similar speed can create unwanted noise, hence offsetting both of them. But for now, let's concentrate on the main version, the NF-A14x25 G2 PWM. That's a long name. It comes in a beautiful packaging, of course it does, already containing a bunch of specs and enough features to make you dizzy. But once you open it, you will get hit with the real technical background and a caution. Now, because I just want to take that caution out, I believe, let's put everything back in. I believe that Noctua did a terrible job with this one here. But let me explain. In the box of accessories you will get the usual Noctua grade stuff, a 30cm long extension, braided, a 1:2 PVM splitter, a low noise adapter to throttle the fan down to 1250 RPM, and a whole bunch of rubber corners, or double of everything if you got the SX2 PP version. Except for the splitter, which does make sense, you got 2 fans, why the hell should they include 2 splitters? Anyway, here comes the catch. Apparently, this is a high precision device with extremely strict tolerances. Noctua's words, not mine. And part of being such a bomb of adjectives means that the fan can be over-tightened. Or as I would put it, you can break the frame. But Noctua has a solution for that, the load relief ring. By default, there is a rubber gasket installed on the backside of the fan, each hole already containing that ring. But in case you want to install the fan with the front side, you would have to either reposition the gasket from the back to the front, because the individual rubber corners by default do not have that load relief ring, or you can replace them with one of the 4 included ones that do have that relief ring. Now, my first issue with this is, why don't the original standard Noctua corners have the relief ring on there in the first place? Wouldn't it be much more beneficial to just install these here and then forget that these even exist in the first place? I mean, I guess design part, I get that, but still. And why does this have to be so complicated? Because Noctua says on here, especially when installing the fans to water cooling radiators. And that makes perfect sense, because even though Noctua does include these rubberized installation things for case use cases, if somebody would decide to use the included screws, because there are regular screws included, but does so by using a Bosch Blue 18 volts 90C, there isn't much that load relief ring will do about it. Oh, and don't get me even started on how unintuitive these two here are. This is a radiator. It took me a while to understand that the fan is installed on a radiator in this image. So let's make this here much simpler. If a Noctua NF-G2 is used on a radiator, a rubber ring should be touching the radiator. That was a single freaking phrase. But Noctua wasn't done, because they also warn you that the max load on each screw cannot exceed 7.5 kg or 30 kilograms in total. So if you want to install this fan, you can either spend a huge amount of money to get a precision screwdriver that can be adjusted to the 0.15 to 0.25 Newton-meter torque that Noctua says, or you just don't go crazy on the fan. I understand that Noctua wants to close all possible loopholes, but come on, this just starts to feel like the don't dry your cat note in the microwave manual. Use the knobs on radiators, and this isn't a car rim. Use some common sense. And with my precision nagging out of the way, Let's talk about the fan itself. The A14x25 G2 PWM can spin up to 1500 RPM whilst pushing up to 91.58 CFM at up to 2.56 mm of H2O. And if we compare that on a stats-to-stats basis to the older gen, it does look like an overall improvement all across the board. However, as you might have seen with that caution, this here is all about the details. The most obvious one being the impeller. Gone is the old school design and in comes the progressive band impeller. And this is a completely new approach as far as I can tell. It is made out of Noctua's version of LCP called Starox, which means that it is very sturdy and it doesn't bend so easily at high speed, though this is like really not high speed. By the way, the frame is not. Unlike the A12X25, the frame is just plain old plastic. Unlike the A12X25, they just didn't do it here. But the main attraction is that double bend that each of the 9 wings have. They call this the progressive band impeller, and of course there is a big ass page on Noctua's website explaining everything. But to cut it short, Noctua did this because they say it helps them to move air towards the outer tip of each blade, which is also what they claim to be the most effective area. This of course works together with the so-called centrifugal turbulator hub on the first attempt, a bunch of indents on top of the central hub which basically do the same thing in tandem. And because that still wasn't enough optimization, they also added little spoilers to each of the blades, calling them winglets, which apparently helps them to reduce vortices, which is the plural of vortex, in case you didn't know, like I didn't know. And fun fact, this is also one of the reasons why planes have winglets. Yeah, no joke, Noctua's fans are to some degree inspired by planes. And moving the air outwards really does work. I tried with the smoke machine, and compared to other fans, you can very clearly see that the smoke is being pushed, like let's say, in this angle out of the fan, where every other fan is just pulling it in wherever and it's just being pushed to the back. Here it is, you can see it is different. Like something is pulling the air or pushing the air away from the central hub, which is kind of cool. I'm really unsure how effective this actually is in a real world environment, but it does work. It does do what they say it does. Then we of course got the usual Noctua treatment as well, stepped in design, acoustic optimizations on the inner side of the frame, extremely tight clearances, you know, whatever they manage to make better, they always do. But they also did some work on the motor itself. There is still Noctua's SSO2 bearing sitting in here, though they claim that it has been further optimized. But what I want to get to is Noctua's ETA perf motor with NEFD6 PVM, IC and Supra torque. No, not that Supra. All of which sounds incredibly complicated, but the important part is that the motor behaves like a closed loop motor. Or maybe it is just a closed loop motor and Noctua wanted to have a fancy ass name to describe that. Anyway, if there is more resistance, like let's say I slap this on a red, the A14X25 will just use some of the excess torque that it has to get the RPM where it should have been. So let's say I say 100% fan speed, so 1500 RPM. No matter if I have it free air, no matter if I step it on a radiator, on a heatsink, on a grill, whatever, it will do everything it can to keep up the 1500 RPM. And no matter which RPM I set it as, I say 90%, it's like 1380 RPM something, it will do so on no matter which device I installed it on. But I also want to mention something else which I found, something about the motor that can sometimes glitch. We saw that on our radiator testing machine and on the little PC that I keep dragging around that I use to, for example, do noise tests, where I could do a mini PC that essentially just controls the fans while I'm doing the noise test. And what I saw there is whenever I lowered the fan speed down, the A14 first took that information, but then it slowly crawled back up to 100%, so the 1500 RPM, which, yeah, it shouldn't do that. It does so for whatever reason, but once I went down to about 60% fan speed, it started to fall. Though it did still spin significantly faster than it should have been at 60%, but it was just weird. And the reason this was happening was because the PWM port was set to auto, which I suppose allowed it to glitch into 3-pin voltage control mode. And I repaired that by just setting the port to always PWM basically. And then it wasn't happening anymore. So I am not sure why this was happening on 2 PCs essentially. If it is a fan problem or it is a motherboard problem, but I saw it twice, so there you go. It could essentially be both. But for you, If your fan behaves weird, just set the port to always PWM. For whatever reason, it glitches sometimes to 3-pin voltage control, and this fan does not like the 3-pin voltage control. Now, before we get to the usual benchmarks, let's also talk about noise, because if there is one thing Noctua emphasized a hell of a lot with this update, then it's less noise for equal or better performance, and they did achieve that. What we have here is the noise on the y-axis and the PWM percentage on the x-axis. And as you can see from start to finish, the G2 A14x25 are in fact quieter by a bit until they both start to hit against my dB meters noise floor. One sooner than the other one, but you get the point. Now don't forget that this does not in any way mean anything for performance. We will get to that later, but first enjoy some noise samples from the old ones versus the new G2. Another important fan or subversion are the A12X25 G2 SX2 PPs. You remember the double package, this one here, that has one fan each being offset by 25 RPM from the original 1500 RPM value. And if we focus on the noise of these individually, their numbers make perfect sense. One is essentially spinning 50 RPM faster than the other one, so everything makes sense. And if we add the regular A14X25 G2 to that whole list, this also makes perfect sense. It marks the middle of the two, and I'm happy my dB meter works. Yay. That was all great, and even if Noctua says the G2 SX2 PP can be beneficial in a side-by-side operation as case intake, they do also say that this is probably to a lesser extent. The real benefit should come when they are sitting on top of a radiator as a push-pull config. So we did exactly that. First we threw two regular A14X25 G2s onto a rad, and then we replaced them with the PP version. And to be extra unfair, I even made sure that the 2500 RPM quicker one is sitting at the front, closest to my dB meter essentially, because as we already found out, it is in fact a tiny bit louder overall. And yeah, to be clear, I do see this as a win, just not a big one. The front one is having the most impact, and even if this is the case, the overall noise seems to be lower, at least at the very top, which is slightly surprising given the unfair nature of this test. And so was the setting at 70%, just at 80% fan speed, there the double regular G2 won. So is the PP edition worth it over the regular one? Probably. I mean, we did see a difference. It is just such a tiny one and near impossible to measure if you don't have like specialized equipment that can do this. I mean, even on Noctua's own graphs, they never claimed that this would be an overall improvement. It's just a tiny one at very specific moments. If possibly preventing that specific phenomenon is worth it to you, great. Generally, as an updated fan, the A14X25 G2 is definitely a big upgrade compared to the old A14 when it comes to noise. But what about performance? We first took it for a spin in our case simulator, where we got two fans recycling the air within a wooden box whilst we measured the performance using a passive Noctua P1 in the middle. For this test, we do mix 120 and 140mm fans because it's the same setup, and because cases usually come with both 120 and 140mm mountings. And running at their max 1500 RPM speed, the A14 G2 managed to keep the temperature of the chip at 43.6 degrees C above ambient. This puts them ever so slightly above the original A14 or the A12X25s, and compared to other 140s, this puts them in a relatively good spot. They did outperform, for example, the Arctic P14, the Be Quiet POing 140s, or Noctua's own Redux 140mm fan. Now, they are not on the highest spot, not by a long shot. And I also saw that when comparing these, people tend to forget that these are very far from like high-speed fans, like the Be Quiet Lightwings 140mm high speed, which are spinning at 2200 RPM, or the Corsair RX 140 at 1700, or the LX 140 at 2000. So overall, fans that land higher also tend to be a lot faster. And considering the somewhat slow 1500 RPM, that 43.6 degrees C above ambient looks very good to me. Even more so because it ties with the Be Quiet Pure Wing 3 high speed, which are 300 RPM faster. And just because, yeah, I wanted to know, I also took the G2 PP edition for a spin, and that one landed at 43.5 degrees C above ambient, so the absolute minimum amount better to even be measurable. Margin of error. Who would have thought offsetting both fans by 25 RPM would not make it out the margin of error? Quelle surprise. So far we know the noise is great and the performance is impressive considering the speed. So let's make the fan spin slower and map out the noise to performance curve. And on here we can see that the G2 is definitely an improvement over the original A14s. From start to finish, this is just plain better. Where the old A14 was pretty close to the Corsair RX 140s, the new one is basically glued against the much smaller but much faster Noctua A12X25. But they are not identical. The A14 G2 does take off a little bit towards the higher end with marginal gains in performance compared to the created noise, but on the flip side it also jumps down to noise loss slightly faster than the smaller counterpart. Compared to something like the Arctic P14 ARGB, which overall tends to be an amazing case fan, it is a bit better, just not to such an extreme degree. Slightly quieter for the same performance at 90 and 100% speed, and they keep the same ratio until the A14 G2 takes over again. Now, even if the A14 G2 is a very good fan noise to performance wise in a case environment, it is not the best I have seen. So far I haven't come across anything that can beat or even be close to the 30mm thick RS140 Max from Corsair. Like, that thing was a beast. Sure, that one is 30mm thick and that's really unfair, but to give you a full picture, the A14 G2 is very good, noise to performance wise very good. It is just not the best that exists under all circumstances. And just because I already made the graph, comparing both the A14 G2 and the PP editions all across the board in case noise to performance, this is really not distinguishable. It's basically the same thing with a margin of error on every step. But what about radiator performance? We test radiator performance on top of a 60mm thick AlphaCool Monster Rad, where we measure the above ambient water temperature and see how low a fan can keep that. For this test, of course, it's 140mm based fans only. It's a 140mm rad after all, and the G2 kept the water at 10.6 degrees C above ambient, which puts it slightly in front of the older NF-A14 and right next to the 30mm thick RS140 Max. Now, that is not a very surprising result. It's a bit better than the old one, sure, and that's good, but it's not a very fast spinning fan. Hence, there are quite a lot of fans above it. The thing is just, again, noise. Compared to the old A14, again, a massive improvement, and overall it is glued to the best one, outperforming the IQ RX 140 from start to finish, and even the RS 140 Max, that one that beat it in case noise to performance, no chance. The only fan that can come even close to the A14 G2 in this benchmark is the Arctic P14 ARGB, but here again, very close, just not quite on the A14 G2 ratio. But they do align at some point once both spin slower. But I also want to shortly get into this graph. First off, I hate it, I really do. I think bar graphs should start at 0 if you don't want to make it look like you are zooming into the most tiny difference. But that's another issue, no. Noctua claims that noise normalized, the new A14X25 G2 keeps whatever about 3 degrees colder above ambient than the old one. And yes, you would need to make the old one spin at 200 RPM slower because it starts off much louder if used on a radiator, but if we look at our results, I can confirm that given a giant margin of error because we use a much thicker radiator and I have no clue what they are actually cooling, but noise normalizing both fans does create a huge difference. So, after what feels like 2 decades, here we are. The new Noctua NF-A14x25 G2 is a very impressive fan. Now, I am not a big fan of calling this a ultra high performance fan. In my eyes, this is just not aimed for that. It is not at all at 1500 RPM. No, this is the I can do great on rads, I can do great on cases, but most importantly, I am optimized so that you will never notice that I'm there in the first place. It is the ultra optimized all-rounder, and for that specific spot, Noctua did a perfect job. No matter if cases or rads, the new A14 whoops the old one's ass, and there are very few fans that can come even close to this one just overall. Now, one thing I immediately noticed, but I can't really put any numbers to it, the new one also pushes air at a much faster, or let's say velocity, I guess. I don't know how to describe it, but already when you use a hand, you can feel, or some toilet paper, I guess, you can feel the air hits much harder. Not even more, it's just, the push is harder, which I guess is thanks to the cool blade design, but I don't know, it's just an incredibly cool fan. But not everything is perfect, like the PWM cable. I am happy that we got the 20 centimeter long cable, which we can expand to 50 with the included extension. That is great. But what the fuck is this? That shouldn't be visible. I don't know. It just downgrades the fan. And I also admire Noctua's, like, we give you all the information that is even available approach, but this is just too much. The average consumer will not read this at best, and at worst, he will be confused by this. I mean, why tell people how much Newton meter they are, or they should not exceed, if nobody will have the tools to measure that in the first place? You know, just tell them to be gentle, and that will do it too. If these 2 points are everything, we got a great fan, and we really do. Impressive what Noctua put together here. The differences to the old one are huge. I love the look. The Noctua brown with less brown might be a choice that you are not very happy with, I get that. But at least the Impeller is one of the most unique updates I have seen to a fan since doing this channel. But the price. Right now, the fan is going for about 38 something here in Europe, or double for the PP version, which is, I mean, compared to some of Corsair's fans, that's like affordable, but still. But in their defense, you got an ultra optimized product with a big ass box of accessories, and to be honest, I do understand the pricing. Noctua is one of these companies that throws, I don't know, millions into research. I mean, whatever they are telling, there is a research paper behind it. It's incredible. And somehow they need to bring the money back. So I get it. It's just not a fan for the masses. But this also leads me to who this fan is for. For people that care about this difference. If you are one of these people and you are ready to spec out a rig with only these and you are willing to pay a couple of $100 for a bunch of case fans, that's great. You will have the most optimized solution, but beware that, for example, something like an Arctic P14A RGB is very, very close to that, or sometimes even better depending on the scenario, for a fraction of the price. But okay, this should be everything on the new Noctua NF-A14x25 G2 PWM, as well as the PP edition. I will never stop pronouncing it like this. And at this point, a huge thank you to Noctua for sending these over. Oh, on a side note, we have a Discord server, so if you want to join, the link is down below. And we got channel membership, so if you are planning to sell your soul for an RG poop emoji, that's one way to go. But if not, I'm also releasing the content to all members 2 or 3 weeks in advance. Except for the NDA stuff, because, you know, I don't want to get sued. Additionally, you can rest assured that the income will not only keep the channel afloat, but it will also serve to redesign this mess. 2 sentences, and Noctua can save some money on printing, and they can lower the price. Anyway, thank you for watching, and if you want to continue, have a look at our take on the height-thick FP12 fan. Completely other direction. If you want to see an unoptimized fan, there you go. Hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.